Welcome to the Mona Charen Show. So glad you could join us today. I am delighted to welcome for a discussion about homelessness a scholar, Michael Tanner, who is with the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. Michael was for many years at the Cato Institute, but he recently made a change. He said, I don't feel like I fit in on the left or the right. I speak to people of varying ideologies in ways that build common ground. I've been around Washington forever and I've seen just about everything. And I've come to the conclusion that maybe helping people escape poverty isn't all about money. So, Michael Tanner, welcome to the show. Glad you could be here.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
So this week, as we're recording this, President Trump has announced that he is federalizing the National Guard in Washington, D.C., and he is going to take a number of steps, including about the homeless population in D.C. And you have written a piece for Free Up, which is the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, called Reimagining the Policy Approach to Homelessness. I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that you don't think the Trump approach is the right one, but let's, before we get there, let's just have you sketch, if you would, the nature of the problem, where we are, how many homeless there are, who are they?
Well, we actually have the highest number of homelessness of homeless people that we've had in several years. It's been steadily rising. Some of that had to do with COVID and the pandemic, but even after we came out of the pandemic and the recovery started, homelessness continued to grow. So we should be aware that the population is still rising. It is not outrageously large. It's between 600,000 and 700,000 generally is the estimate. That's a point of time estimate. It's not the best estimate. If people go out one night a year and they count people physically, it's sort of like a census. So you have a volunteer walking under a bridge and counting 1, 2, 3, 4 people living here. They record it. So I wouldn't put a huge amount of faith in the particular numbers, but it's probably somewhere in that general range, under 1 million people, but probably more than 500,000 that are out there. And there's really, you can break down homelessness into two different categories, if you will. And I think part of the mistake we make is to try to treat all homeless people the same. One group of people really have problems. They have substance abuse problems. They suffer from mental illness or other issues that generally prevent them from taking care of themselves. And they need to be handled in one way. The second group of people who are essentially people who fell to the street because they could not find affordable housing. And the answer for them is to find ways in which we can make housing more affordable. And I think we have to treat both problems simultaneously.
So give us a sense of how many people fall into each category. How many have substance abuse and mental illness problems? And how many are there because they cannot find affordable housing?
Sure, between 20 and 40% is generally the guesstimate for how many people have either substance abuse or mental health issues. Now, there's a little bit of a chicken and egg that comes there. Some people who didn't have these problems before they ended up on the street develop them afterwards. They're sort of self-medicating because, frankly, life on the street is not a fun way to live. And so they often drink or take drugs in order to deal with their problems while they're there. People who were medicated when they're in other circumstances lose their medication or don't have access to it when they're on the street, so it makes it worse. So it's not necessarily that they ended up on the street because of their substance abuse or drug addiction, but they certainly have it once they're there, and it makes it harder for them to get off. So I would say put it somewhere in that maybe a third, let's call it.
And to understand how so many mentally ill people came to be living under bridges and in various places on the street, we have to talk about deinstitutionalization. That was a policy innovation that was bipartisan, right? 1960s. We, as a society, sort of came to the belief, not entirely without reason, right, that mental institutions were cruel, that they were the sites of abuse of people, and that people's autonomy was not being respected. So talk a little bit about that. Talk about because in your piece you mentioned there were some cultural sort of moments that crystallized public opinion and made deinstitutionalization the goal. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the deinstitutionalization was one of the great bipartisan failures of our time, if it will. People try to think of it as being blamed on one side or the other. Everybody supported deinstitutionalization. Ronald Reagan signed one of the largest deinstitutionalization bills when he was governor of California. At the same time, it was backed by the ACLU, and groups on the left were pushing for more deinstitutionalization. This was something that everybody sort of supported. And it was driven in part, as you say, because the mental institutions at the time were real horror stories. There was the Life magazine expose that was done in the 1950s, I believe, where they had photographs from many of the mental hospitals that were out there, people who were essentially naked, covered in feces, lying on the floor, no beds, no treatment, just kind of warehouse there. You also have some cases in New York in the 1960s that were also exposed. In fact, I believe Geraldo Rivera won an Emmy for an expose on a mentalist hospital on Long Island. So
it's called Willowbrook, right?
Exactly, Willowbrook.
I'm old enough to remember that, alas.
We're all a little bit getting up there when we remember that. But this was really driven by public outrage at the treatment of the mentally ill. And at the same time, we were developing new medications, anti-schizophrenia drugs, and things that we thought would be super saviors, that we could give everybody a pill and they'd be cured. And there was a push towards kind of community treatment. We were going to get community centers. John F. Kennedy talked about building 1,500 community mental health centers so people could walk in off the street and be treated. The result, unfortunately, none of these things sort of held true. We ended up closing the mental institutions without finding a follow-up for them, without ensuring any way that people actually receive treatment. We found more side effects to some of the super drugs that we were taking, and people didn't like taking them. And the community health centers never got built. So the people just kind of ended up on the street with nowhere to go. So that was
because people didn't want those institutions in their neighborhoods. It was the NIMBYism, right?
Always NIMBYism at the heart of these things. And it's understandable. Those are not, you not want your neighbors, your kids coming home from school and the mentally ill waiting outside for them. I mean, you can understand why people did this.
Sure.
But the result was they didn't get built anywhere, and they have to go somewhere.
If you're like me, you've noticed that getting older is full of little wake-up calls. You start seeing more hair in the drain, your part looks wider, and suddenly you're zooming in on old photos wondering if your hair was always this thin. That's why I'm really loving what OneSkin is doing. Their OS01 peptide has been transforming our skin here at the Mona Charen Show for a while. Now, with their new scalp serum, OS01 Hair, it's here to help us with hair loss, thinning, and shedding. Why would a skincare company create a scalp treatment? Well, because the scalp is skin. And just like the rest of your body, it experiences cellular aging. But instead of wrinkles, it messes with your hair follicles and natural growth cycle, leading to hair loss and thinning. OS1 Hair is the first scalp serum powered by OneSkin's OS01 peptide, which targets those aging cells called senescent cells, and it's scientifically proven to help your hair cells do what they're meant to do. Grow denser, fuller, healthier hair. Get to the root of hair loss and thinning with OS01 Hair. You'll save 15% on your first purchase with code MONACHAREN at oneskin.co. Anybody who knows me knows that I am really, I don't, obsess about personal appearance, but two things I'm really into are healthy teeth and healthy hair. So this is very important to me. Founded and led by an all-woman team of skin longevity scientists, OneSkin is redefining the aging process with their proprietary OS01 peptide, the first ingredient proven to help skin look, feel, and behave like its younger self. Get 15% off with code MONACHAREN at oneskin.co. That's 15% off at oneskin.co with code Mona Charen. After you purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them we sent you. Invest in the health and longevity of your skin with OneSkin. Your future self will thank you. So the number of patients in mental hospitals went from around 500,000 or 500,000 in the 1950s to 100,000 by the mid 1980s. And today, only about 50,000 people in the United States reside in mental health hospitals. And of course, mental health hospitals now are not guilty of the kinds of abuses that they were in the 50s. But there are many fewer of them. There just aren't even beds. I mean, I know from personal experience with family members who needed mental health care, and you cannot find it. I mean, there are just no beds.
Yeah, that's a big problem. The beds aren't there, and where they are, they're often misallocated. They're not located where the people who need them are. So you find places like California where there's an enormous problem. About half of all the unhoused homeless live in California. They have an enormous number that are suffering from mental illness. Yet there's thousands of mental health beds short of what they need in that state.
Yeah. So a lot of people, a really shocking number of mentally ill people wind up in prisons, right? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, because we don't have any other way to take care of them, if people are a danger to themselves or others, we generally rely on law enforcement to deal with this. And that's sort of why I worry a little bit about what's going to happen in Washington, D.C. Police are not trained to deal with the mentally ill. They're not trained on how you help these folks or how to approach them, how to talk to them. The things often escalate when they do. The mental health checks are dangerous for both the police and the person being checked on. And in many cases, things go tragically wrong. And in addition, you again can come up with the problem of what you're going to do with them once you pick them up. If you put somebody in jail for the weekend, you're only going to let them out a few days later. Because they're not committing any sort of real crime that you could lock them up for, so they're going to get out. But in the meantime, they've lost their tent, they've lost their identification, they've lost medication if they had any. If they're men taking care of women, the women are now on their own where they're in physical danger of abuse. So you have all sorts of problems that you're simply making worse because you haven't got a real plan. You're just sort of trying to move people from one spot to another.
Which, I mean, we might as well talk about this now. I mean, it doesn't sound like this administration has, I mean, they don't have any plan whatsoever to deal with homeless people in the district. It's clear that what they're going to do is just either arrest them or force them out, force them to move somewhere else, which doesn't solve anybody's problem. Yeah, aesthetics.
We won't see them, down on the mall anymore, which is good for tourism. Or we're just going to pick them up and move them to Arlington or something like that, which is bad for Arlington. Now we'll have to figure out what to do with these folks. It's like years ago, you may remember, now I'm dating myself, they used to deal with prostitution that way. They'd march them all across the bridge to Virginia. Yeah. And then abandon them there. And, it didn't really solve the problem. It just made it someone else's problem.
And to be fair to those in cities and places where the homeless are present, having people living on the streets isn't good for anybody. It's not good for the homeless themselves. Obviously, they are much more often the victims of crime than they are perpetrators of crimes, but they also do commit crimes at a higher rate than the average population.
Sure.
Yeah. And they are, they are antisocial in the sense that sometimes they scream at people coming by, or they defecate on the streets or urinate. All of those things are huge problems that, a well-run society should not have. Plus, it's really, it's very sad to see people living in tents like that. It's not humane to have anybody living in those conditions and suffering from all the diseases and hardships. Okay. So that is the portion that are either substance abusers or mentally ill. Let's talk now about the other half of this, or whatever percentage it is. The people who, maybe they start out, living, they One of the things that surprised me in your article was how many people who are homeless are actually working. It was more than 50%.
Yeah, that's right. At least in Washington, D.C., there's a study that showed about 49%, I believe, there. One in Chicago, about the same, about half were working. Now, they may not be working 40 hours a week. It may be a few hours here and there that they're getting some money for food, but they're still capable of working. And I think, again, we can look at sort of the California as an example of all this. I was out there for a while working specifically on this issue, met with a lot of folks who were living on the streets. But I met people who were teachers, an emergency room nurse, state employees. But essentially, you were working at, say, Sacramento or San Francisco. There was no such thing as affordable housing there. You couldn't afford to take the 3 to 4 hour commute in from someplace like Stockton every day. So you lived in your car. You basically drove in on Monday morning and lived in your car until you went back on the weekend to find someplace you could afford to live in.
So why is there such a shortage of affordable housing? And then, let's start with that. And then I'd like to get to the question of families because, I would be curious to your views on how much family breakdown, family disintegration has contributed to the problem of homelessness, because these are people who don't have a sister that they can crash on her sofa or, a husband, relative that they can rely on. But so talk about affordable housing, and then let's talk about the family angle, if you would.
Yeah, affordable housing is a big part of this. Look at California with the huge homelessness problem. It is also one of the least affordable states to live in terms of housing. And why? Because they've made it almost impossible to build housing. You mentioned NIMBYism earlier. That's a huge problem, not just there, but everywhere around the country that's driving up the cost of housing. We use building regulations and zoning laws to basically prevent this type of multifamily housing that's affordable for many people to live in. But
what about in a place like New York? I mean, New York has nothing but multifamily housing, right? I mean, so what's the issue there?
Well, they actually have less than you. They think a lot of it is duplexes, and a lot of it is very limited in terms of who can live there. They haven't really been expanded the type of affordable housing, the type of low-end apartments that are necessary for match the growth in the population there.
Okay, well, Mom Donnie says he's going to build housing. So what's wrong with his plan? One of the few good things
about him is he does say he's going to cut through the red tape to make housing easier to build, which would be a great thing to do. On the other hand, he also says he's going to impose rent control, or stronger rent control, which is going to prevent people from wanting to create apartments and rent them. So,
can you spell that out a little bit for those of the audience who are not like libertarian minded? Explain why rent control creates fewer apartment units for rent.
Sure. It does it on two fronts. One is it keeps the people who are in a rent-controlled apartment in that rent-controlled apartment. Nobody wants to move out where they're going to have to pay full value for the rent. So you often get people like Charlie Rangel used to live in a rent-controlled apartment when he was in Congress. People inherit them. They pass them down to their kids. And being in a rent-controlled apartment is a huge value because you're paying a fraction of what the value of that house or that apartment would be on the open market. So it keeps people locked in place. That means new people can't move in there. Someone who's making a couple $100,000 a year might be living in an apartment, and that prevents somebody making $50,000 a year from moving into that apartment. So on the sort of that front, you have a problem. On the other side of that, the landlords, potential landlords, or the developers look at it and say, I'm not going to be able to get enough to recoup my cost for building more housing or from keeping my apartment in repair, dealing with all the problems like boilers and air conditioning and things that landlords have to deal with, because I can't raise the rents to cover my cost. I'm going to be locked in at a fraction of what I'm spending. So I'm just going to build a condo instead and sell it to some Wall Street guy where I can make sure I get my money back.
So there is a shortage of housing, and you lay out like why this is beyond rent control. What are the reasons for the really drastic lack of affordable housing?
Well, I think we've driven up the cost of housing a lot of ways. There are basically three parts that go into housing: the cost of land, the cost of building the housing itself, and the cost of complying with the regulations that are out there. Some of them are use taxes, because of more housing means more sewage and water pipes and police and fire, and so we charge sort of development fees that have to be paid on that. Often they go up with the cost of the house, so those add cost to it. Trump's tariffs are going to add significantly to the cost of housing. We're talking about lumber and concrete and things that are used to build houses are all going to go up. To some degree, the crackdown on immigration limits labor supply, which is going, particularly in the building trades industry, which hires a lot of undocumented workers, and that's going to make an increase in cost of labor in building these houses. And environmental regulations, of course, we need to look at, add significantly to the cost of housing.
Hi, everyone. We all have our secret weaknesses, and I must confess that one of mine is shopping online for clothing. I don't always buy, but I do like to sneak over and see what's out there. And you know what the disappointing part is? So much of the time, it's just you cannot find the basics that are so important to your wardrobe. You just can't. I mean, you'll find all kinds of flowery things, but like a simple white top or black or, something basic is really hard to find. And that's why I was so excited when Quince became a sponsor, because I had already found them on my own before they became a sponsor of this podcast. So not only do they have those basics that we all need, but they have them at unbelievable prices. So, and it's good quality stuff. So I don't know how they do it, but they really do deliver a good product at a very fair price. They have, for example, 100% European linen shorts and dresses from $30. They have Luke's swimwear, Italian leather platform sandals. They have leather jackets that are really nice. They have all kinds of really good things. And again, as I say, it's like the basics for your wardrobe that are good quality. How do they do this? Well, apparently by working with top artisans and cutting out the middlemen, so that they can give you the luxury without the markup. Give your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/Mona for free shipping and 365-day returns. That's quince.com/Mona to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/Mona. And we thank them for sponsoring this podcast. I had Mark Dunkelman on a few weeks back. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he wrote a book about why nothing works, and we hit upon this theme, and he cites the explosion of regulations on things like building housing that has happened over the last several decades as being one of the reasons for the shortage. That, it takes forever to get these permits, and then there are a million different hoops that you have to jump through, not just environmental, but, all kinds of other regulations that make it more difficult to just say, you know what, there's a market for housing, let's build something.
Yeah, there's certainly some regulations that we're all in favor of. We want hurricane-resistant houses in Florida, for example,
right,
or earthquake-resistant houses in LA. But on the other hand, there's things like how many stairways you have to have in an apartment complex, and where they have to open out, what size windows do you have to have, what kind of window panes do you need to have in this house. All of those type of things, the fittings, are they supposed to be brass, are they not? Often these things are designed to make the cost expensive. Again, kind of an indirect NIMBYism, if you will, but they don't want inexpensive housing in their neighborhood, so they insist on certain very expensive building techniques and materials that ensure that only the houses that build are going to be large. The lot size is often in these things. You have to have so many square footage of lawn in order to put up a house. Parking requirements are among the worst regulations. You have to have one or two parking spaces for every bedroom you have in the complex. So all of those things add to the cost.
You then sketch out two different approaches that you say have been unsuccessful. One approach that is favored by Democrats is called housing first. And this is something that the Obama administration was very much behind, that many Democratic mayors, if you look at the various organizations, National Association of Counties is for it, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, as well as others, they all say that housing first is the way to go. You don't agree. So what?
It sounds good. I mean, if people are living on the streets because they don't have housing, let's give them a house.
Right.
It certainly sounds logical.
Mm-hmm.
The problems with it is there's multiple problems with it. One is that it doesn't actually appear to work. If you actually look at the people you're putting into housing, many of them drift away out of the housing within a relatively short period of time. If you actually look at 10 years down the road, for example, they're not, as bad as it would be to still be living in subsidized housing, they're not even that. They're back on the street again in 2-4 years or so on, because you haven't dealt with the underlying problems. If they're mental health or substance abuse or an inability to earn a living wage or whatever it might be, you haven't dealt with any of those problems. The second problem is that it's hugely expensive. The cost of building these apartments can be $800,000 in some cases or more in places, and that's in inexpensive places like Alabama. They're spending that kind of housing for each unit that they're creating. California is well over $1 million to create a unit that you're going to have somebody live in. In the states, you're not doing anything to lower the cost of building housing. You're simply having the government subsidize the high costs that exist. So those don't seem to work. And finally, I don't think you're able to, you're not forcing the worst in need into this housing. How are you going to get people off the street who don't want to go into housing because they are not able to take care of themselves because of their mental problems or the drug or substance abuse problems?
Oh, yeah. Speaking of that, let's go back to what I raised earlier. Talk about whether you think family structure plays a role here. The fact that more and more Americans are living alone, fewer and fewer big families, fewer and fewer families, period, in this country.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly makes a difference. When people, I should note that statistically, when people talk about the homeless, there's sort of what's called the housed homeless and the unhoused homeless. And I talk about the unhoused homeless in California when they said they'd have half. There's sort of a housed homeless category, which is crashing on your brother-in-law's couch. Which among the options for that. It's also shelters and things, but that used to be a much bigger option. You ran into a problem and it was going to last you a couple of months. They'd put you up in the basement and what have you. Now your brother-in-law lives 1,000 miles away. He's not in the town with you or something like that. It's not as easy to do as it once was. So kind of civil society in general has fallen apart in the last couple of decades, and that makes a difference in what's available. And then, of course, you have a lack of, again, once people have substance abuse or mental health problems, the sort of conservatorship laws that used to allow families to intervene and force people into treatment have been weakened in ways that make it hard for them to do anything.
There's an organization that I used to donate to called the Treatment Advocacy Center. It was started by a psychiatrist named E. Fuller Torrey, and they advocated for something called AOT, Assisted Outpatient Treatment. And what they suggested is highly relevant to homelessness. What they suggested is that people who are falling through the cracks because they have severe mental illness, that what the states should do, and I think something like 44 states have passed laws mandating assisted outpatient treatment. So I'm not sure if all these states have it, why hasn't it worked? But what it does is, it does sound good to me anyway, which is it ties the receipt of government benefits like SSI or Medicaid to complying with your treatment. So you have to show up to get your medicine. You have to take your medicine in front of the social worker or whatever in order to be eligible for these other government benefits. And they also provide, other kinds of treatment, substance abuse programs and various things. But there's a real stick there. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it sounds like a terrific idea. I think part of the problem that you're seeing is that the people who are really incapable of taking care of themselves and are a danger to themselves and others aren't collecting their benefits. They're not collecting their SSI check. They are not capable of even finding the office where they could get their check. But some sort of mechanism, coercive mechanism to force some people into treatment is going to be necessary. We're going to have to go back, whether it's outpatient treatment with some sort of benchmarks along the way, or whether it's institutionalization. We are going to have to go back to some sort of required treatment for some people. Now, we obviously need to be very careful how we do this. It's subject to so many abuses in the past, not just the institutions that we talked about, but who was subject to that. There's, in history, women who weren't sufficiently submissive to their husbands could be locked up
That's
in
right.
asylum. Until they got into the 1950s, that was occurring.
Yeah.
LGBTQ youth, it's a problem. It's a problem even today. If you have, we don't want outside political views. If you're pro-Trump or anti-Trump, we don't want people saying, "Oh, you're crazy." You can remember the old Soviet Union locked people up for being against the invasion of Czechoslovakia. So
that's right. They said if you were against the government's policy, you were obviously insane.
That's right. So we need to be really careful that there's some sort of safeguards in place to protect individual rights. So we're not just talking about lifestyles we disapprove of or things of that nature. That said, there are ways to do that. California has introduced what they call conservatorship courts. You can, the authorities or family members can apply for conservatorship, which allows you to institutionalize or require outpatient treatment from somebody who's suffering from mental illness. There's a public defender type that's appointed to look after that individual's civil rights to ensure that they're protected along the way. The courts are specially trained in mental illness issues so that they can know what is and what is not appropriate in terms of treatment for this person's problem. That sort of thing we can move forward on. Now, that's very, very new. We don't know what the outcomes are going to be. A lot of jurisdictions in California have resisted it because it costs money. And they're happy to make it someone else's problem that they don't have to spend money on. But that's something worth watching and seeing if that turns out.
So we need to revisit ways of humanely and responsibly getting treatment to people who are not getting it and desperately need it. They really just cannot take care of themselves. And it's more humane to require some kind of treatment than it is to say, we respect your civil rights sleeping under that bridge.
Yeah, I'm struck by Scott Wiener, who's from San Francisco, who's, I think, the deputy minority leader in the California Senate, one of the most progressive folks you'll ever find, says, look, there's nothing compassionate or progressive about watching somebody die in the street.
Yeah, exactly. So we have to revisit that. We have to figure out ways of building more affordable housing, though that is a multi-pronged thing. And there are so many aspects of how we got here. It's not going to be easy to unravel all that. Some of the things that you mentioned, that are new, they're going to be newly added on, the price of lumber and the price of labor and all that because of Trump's tariffs. And then, of course, all of these regulations and so forth. That's going to be tough, but that's necessary.
I will say there's hope on the housing front. The YIMBY, or Yes in My Backyard movement, has spread across the country. Started in California for obvious reasons, but it's spread out. It's bipartisan. It's drawing, attention from everyone from Mamdani to the White House. in terms of we need to be able to deregulate the housing market and build stuff. We need to, as you say, actually make things work sometimes in this country again. And I think that movement is a cause for hope on that front.
There's somebody named Erica Sandberg who lives in San Francisco. I think she's a finance gal. Anyway, she was seeing the problem of homelessness, which is so evident in San Francisco, and just was really getting so exasperated that this was happening in a great city and so frustrated. She started a movement that's really interesting. It's called Downtown Streets Teams. And that's just the name of the organization, the nonprofit that she founded. But what they do, their approach is they have teams that go out and they hire the homeless who are capable of working. They hire them to do, street cleaning, washing graffiti off buildings, whatever. They pay them. And they have had tremendous success in getting people, because after they've been working with these downtown streets teams for a few weeks or months, they then have a work history that they are able to present to an employer. And a lot of them go on to get regular jobs and get out of homelessness. Plus, they're not panhandling. They're actually doing work that needs doing and that brings with it a certain level of self-respect. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's terrific. It's in New York as well. There's the Doe Foundation in New York, which is something very similar. In fact, if you go to New York, you'll often in the various districts, particularly in the downtown area around the tourist districts, see these folks in these red, white, and blue uniforms that are sweeping the streets, what have you. They are from the Doe Foundation, which again recruits the homeless, brings them in, teaches them some basic skills. And it's not we're going to spend the next 6 months teaching you to be a coder or whatever. It is
right.
The practical stuff. You have to show up for work every day at a particular time. You have to take your lunch break and come back from it. That sort of thing. Mm-hmm. They put them on the street. They're paid minimum wage. They're given the place to sleep at night in the shelter that the fund runs. And, in the spare time that they are taught other skills, they have to put some money away. If they have families, they have to put some money away for child support for their families. They're required to pay back fines and criminal penalties that they've incurred over the years. So there's strict requirements on them. But when people graduate from that, and they've actually had this followed, there's a Harvard study that was done on them, that a surprising number of them were able to get out of homelessness, to get jobs, to stay off the streets. It has a success rate.
So there are things that are encouraging if we are still interested in solving problems in this country. And some people like you obviously are. Thank you for your work. And you also have written on a lot on poverty and on anti-poverty programs and so on. So if you want to say a word or two of what else you would like to draw listeners and viewers' attention to that you've worked on, now's your chance.
Well, I would just make a larger point overall, if I could, to close it out. I would just say we sort of need to understand that poverty is not a moral failing. People are not poor because they're bad people. And I think sometimes we sort of look down on the person who's living on the street or the poor person, and we say it's all their own fault. They just got to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. On the other hand, we've also should have learned by now that one more program, one more government check, one more handout is not going to fix the problem. Or, we do a pretty good job in this country of ensuring that nobody starves to death. We're not the South Sudan. We do a pretty good job of ensuring that the poverty is less miserable than it would otherwise be. But we don't do a very good job in this country of helping people get out of poverty altogether, of becoming self-sufficient and self-supporting, and basically rising as far as their individual talents can take them, becoming kind of masters of their own fate. We need to pay more attention to that, put more effort into how we can help people rise out of poverty than we do on what causes poverty itself.
Well, thank you, Michael Tanner, so much for coming on, sharing your thoughts with us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure, anytime.